Good evening. I'd like to welcome everybody online listening tonight. Today is December 3rd, 2024, and this is the reorganization meeting of the Pine-Richland School Board. Please rise and join with me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, there's nobody online who has asked to address the board, so we'll move on, and there's nobody in the audience. Even though this is not an election year, I would like to introduce the 2025 school board for Pine-Richland. We'll start on the far side. Mr. Cassidy, Mrs. Miller, Mrs. Hillman, Mrs. Brusalis, Mr. Weethorn, Mr. Morset, Mrs. Turchik, Mr. Kashani, and Mrs. Fortier. Thank you. Moving on to item 201. I now call for nominations for the temporary chairperson.
Madam Secretary, I'd like to nominate Mrs. Brusalis for temporary president.
Any other nominations?
I'd like to nominate Mr. Kashani for temporary president.
Okay. You should have a ballot in front of you. If you could please vote for your person, I'll walk around and gather them. Okay. Mrs. Fortier voted for Mr. Kashani. Mr. Cassidy voted for Mr. Kashani. Mr. Kashani voted for Mr. Kashani. Mrs. Turchik voted for Mr. Kashani. Mr. Morset voted for Mrs. Brusalis. Mr. Weethorn voted for Mrs. Brusalis. Mrs. Hillman voted for Mrs. Brusalis. Mrs. Miller voted for Mrs. Brusalis, and Mrs. Brusalis voted for Mrs. Brusalis. That's 5-4. Mrs. Brusalis, you are temporary president. I'll bring over some information. It's the script, and then also the part here on the agenda.
I now call for, we're moving on to item 2.02, which is the election of the board president. I now call for nominations for school board president.
I'd like to nominate Mr. Cassidy.
I'd like to nominate Phil Morset.
Any other nominations?
In your folder, you should have ballots as well. And if you could fill out the first one, that would be great. Okay, Mr. Kashani voted for Mr. Cassidy. Mrs. Turchik voted for Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Weethorn voted for Mr. Morset. Mrs. Brusalis voted for Mr. Morset. Mrs. Miller voted for Mr. Morset. Mrs. Hillman voted for Mr. Morset. Mr. Cassidy voted for Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Morset voted for Mr. Morset. Mrs. Fortier voted for Mr. Cassidy. Again, 4-5. Mr. Morset, you will continue as president.
Thank you. Okay, I'm moving on to item 2.03, election of a board vice president. Do I have any nominations? I'd like to nominate Mrs. Hillman.
I'd like to nominate Mrs. Turchek.
Okay. Again, you should have a ballot. Okay, Mrs. Hillman voted for Mrs. Hillman. Mr. Wheathorn voted for Mrs. Hillman. Mr. Morset voted for Mrs. Hillman. Mrs. Fortier voted for Mrs. Turchik. Mr. Kashani voted for Mrs. Turchik. Mrs. Turchik voted for Mrs. Turchik. Mrs. Brusalis voted for Mrs. Hillman. Mrs. Miller voted for Mrs. Hillman. And Mr. Cassidy voted for Mrs. Turchik. That's another 4-5. Mrs. Hillman, you'll be Vice President.
All right, moving on to item 2.04, establish public board meeting dates. It's an action item. Motion to approve the Pine-Richland School Board 2025 meeting schedule as noted below.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. Any discussion on the calendar? With no discussion, we'll go to a vote. All in favor? Yes.
Yes.
All opposed? Motion passes. Item 2.05, newspaper of general circulation. This is an action item. Motion to designate Pittsburgh Post-Gazette as the district's newspaper of general circulation as defined in accordance with law. Do I have a second?
Second.
Motion is made and seconded. Any discussion on this item? With no discussion, we move to a vote. All in favor? Yes.
Yes.
All opposed? Motion passes. Item 2.06, facsimile signature approval. This is an action item. Motion to permit the board secretary to obtain stamps bearing the signatures of the board officers for 2025 and to affix the officer stamp signatures in lieu of handwritten signatures to original agreements, resolutions, and other documents approved by the board.
Second.
Motion is made and seconded. Any discussion on this? With no discussion, we move to vote. All in favor?
Yes.
All opposed? Motion passes. Item 2.07, appointment of legislative representative to PSBA. It's a call for nominations. Do we have any nominations?
I'd like to nominate Leslie Miller.
Any other nominations?
I'd like to nominate myself, Ashley Fortier.
Okay, that's two. Do we have any more? Okay.
You do have a ballot.
You have a ballot, yep, PSBA representative, round one. Mrs. Williams will collect those.
Okay, Mrs. Fortier voted for Mrs. Fortier. Mr. Kashani voted for Mrs. Miller. Mr. Morset voted for Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Brusalis voted for Mrs. Miller. Mr. Wheathorn voted for Mrs. Miller. Mr. Cassidy voted for Mrs. Fortier. Mrs. Miller voted for Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Hillman voted for Mrs. Miller. And Mrs. Turchik voted for Mrs. Fortier. That is 6-3. Mrs. Miller, you will be our representative.
Okay. All right, moving on to item 2.08, appointment of A.W. Beatty, Joint Operating Committee representatives. There is one position open. Mr. Cassidy is on a 2-year assignment, so he's already filled 1 year. This is his 2nd year coming up. Mrs. Miller was on there for the first year on a 1-year assignment. This is the vacant seat right now. Do I have any nominations for A.W. Beatty?
Nominate Mrs. Miller.
I'd like to nominate myself, Ashley Fortier.
Any other nominations? Okay, we got a, it's in front of you as a vote, as a ballot for A.W. Beatty.
Okay, Mr. Kashani voted for Mrs. Fortier. Mrs. Miller voted for Mrs. Miller. Mr. Cassidy voted for Mrs. Fortier. Mr. Morset voted for Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Turchek voted for Mrs. Fortier. Mr. Wheathorn voted for Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Brusalis voted for Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Hillman voted for Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Fortier voted for Mrs. Fortier. It's 4-5. Mrs. Miller, you will represent A.W. Beatty.
Just a point of information, is that a 2-year assignment now?
Yes, hers will now be a 2-year because Mr. Cassidy's is a 1-year now.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to item 2.09, appointment of a representative for the Pine Township Parks and Recreation Board. This is a position that's been held by Mrs. Turchik, I believe, 3 years running right now. Do I have any nominations?
Person does need to live in Pine.
Yeah. I mean, I'm willing to do it again if there's someone else in Pine that wants to do it. Go ahead.
I'll nominate Amy.
Okay, no other, not just one. So
Okay, so
then, yeah.
Mrs. Turchik?
Mrs.
Yeah, that's
Turchik will be,
Okay.
okay. Item 2.10, appointment of a Food Service Advisory and Wellness Committee representative. It's a call for nominations. Do I have any nominations?
I'd like to nominate Ashley Fortier.
Any other nominations? None being, then Mrs. Fortier, you have that. Moving on to item 2.11, appointment of delegate to Allegheny North Tax Collection Committee. The motion, Chris Jeswick is the voting representative, and as the alternate voting representative, Mr. Cassani, I believe, has represented that in the past.
Yeah, I'll nominate Mr. Kashani again to do it, if you want to do it.
Yeah, the time commitment's really, really horrible, but I guess I'll do it again, yeah.
Any
The
other
alternate,
nominations?
by the way, the alternate has never had to be used.
Is that right?
That's right. Knock on wood. Mr.
Yeah,
Knock
Jessup.
on wood,
yeah,
yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, no other nominations, then it passes, it's approved. Okay. All right, moving on to item 4.01, recognition of visitors.
We do have somebody online who has signed up, just one person. So, Andrew, if you could call Mrs. Bayer. We're a little bit early, but. Hello, Ms. Baer? Hello?
Yes.
Hi, you're on with the board.
Oh, okay. I was trying to sign up before the meeting. I'm not sure if that happened or not, but I'll still give my comments I was saying I'm eagerly awaiting hearing this group discuss board reorganization tonight. Based on the way this group has conducted itself the last several months, I feel strongly that 5 of you, Mr. Morissette, Ms. Brusalis, Ms. Miller, Mr. Whitethorn, and Ms. Tillman, have no business even serving on this board, let alone serving in leadership positions. I know I'm not alone in feeling this way, and that you've received many emails calling for your resignation. Mr. Whitethorn, your behavior at the last meeting was especially egregious. We all sat through several hours of meetings in the spring when the library policy was discussed. We heard over and over again about the importance of examining these books in their entirety. Yet your insistence on reading only a string of the most disturbing language from a book dealing with sexual abuse without context highlighted just how little regard you have for our librarians and staff who had pleaded with you to avoid doing the exact thing that you did. Mr. Morissette, as president, you allowed this last meeting to be rushed forward without regard for the availability of your board members and without even pretending to care about the availability of the library staff. Yet you had the audacity to try and shift the blame for your lack of preparation, once again, onto them because they only submitted an incredibly detailed document highlighting their concerns with this policy the Friday before the meeting. You had 3 days to read it. Where's the acknowledgement of the work it took them to get such a thorough document together on such short notice? What a stand-up move there, Mr. President. Ms. Brusalis, I remain baffled that you're allowed a seat at this table with your clear conflict of interest. To this current block of 5, I'd like to reiterate my utter disappointment with the past you're forcing this district down. Your behavior as a whole has been absolutely appalling. The lack of respect you have shown that our teachers, staff, and fellow board members is disturbing. The damage you are causing our district is real. Please stop. Please put people who are willing to consider something other than themselves into leadership positions. Please recognize that none of you are up for the task. Thank you.
Thank you. That's our last
Anyone else?
speaker. That's it.
Okay. Let's move on to item 4.02, adjournment of the meeting. Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay, good night.
Thank you, Barb.